The lesson for our Koine Project class considers a question I recently had brought to my attention. That is, it was brought to my attention, the dispensational question, and a lot of interest in it. Now, I would like to evaluate dispensationalism, and I'm curious about it. And I was noticing a direction toward which I was pointed to review Dr. Paul Felter. His YouTube channel is called Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth. So I looked at it, noticed what he said, and I'm asking the question, does he have a case for falling away, meaning the rapture, or referring to the rapture, because it should be translated departure. So that's a good question because he made a comment about, Dr. Felter said context, 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 and he correlated that with the common statement about real estate is location, location, location. And then he made a statement, words can have different meanings in different contexts. Actually, what is the fact and the case is that usage and meaning are different, but the word will stay the same, the actual term itself. So we can go to a Koine text, for example, 1 Timothy 4:1. Well, let me just read that. There's no reason to leave that without reading it. This is the English King James, my Walter Martin's Cults Reference Bible. Treasure it. They're still out there. If you haven't got one, you can get one online. But in 1 Timothy 4:1, it says, now the Spirit speaketh expressly that in the latter time some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. So that's a case in point where a departure is mentioned. It's apostasontai. I should have said ontai, excuse me. I'm learning to be corrected by people who corrected me. So now it's in my head. That's the ending. And it's third person plural. And this means stand. This means away from. Away from. Literally stand away from. Notice that. Stand. So etymologically speaking, it will always be the same meaning. Away from and stand. And this middle refers to for themselves. They did this of their own. In one text, I think it speaks of a deponent verb, which we'll go and talk about that some other time in another lesson. It's middle and passive in form, but active in meaning. But in this case, the idea of this is something they of their own accord do. Well, then he referred to a KJV text. This is the Koine text that we're doing in this lesson. So I've just placed this one here for what we're doing. And then here's what he quoted. He quoted a KJV text, Acts 21:21, to forsake Moses. And that was the noun that he was referring to, as in 2 Thessalonians, where he speaks of the falling away, which must take place first. So here's away from. Away from. And then here's stand. So a stand away from. Now, we know one thing's for certain is that in our case, when the man of sin appears, and we know many antichrists have already gone into the world, that we stand away from them. We don't approach them. So there's two directions, two groups of people that when the lawless one in the future, as it's always adamantly affirmed, and then the many antichrists that are now out there, we stand away from them. That's why when you hear pastors preach and call people to come out from among that or from among them, they're speaking of both the false teachers and their false doctrines. As Paul was telling Timothy, they'll give heed to seducing spirits and doctrines of devils. Very fascinating, that English usage there and that characterization. So let's remember, usage is different. That is, usage, but the meaning's always the same. So context will tell us how it's used. But it's interesting, he made the case for context. Words can have different meanings in different contexts, but then he insists on the text 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, where it says, except there come a falling away first. Well, first of all, he says, does a great falling away precede the 7-year tribulation? Well, he goes back to earlier English translations, is what really intrigued me. And he was showing that Tyndale, for example, that earlier translation that preceded the King James Version, even he quoted from the Geneva, which translated this term in that particular text in Thessalonians as departure. And then he said it was a great mystery why the King James Version translated falling away. Now that would be a good question for hermeneutics and for us who use the language to notice that we don't just go and get a term and then place it, because here, forsake Moses, that's speaking of the motive that they were assigning and accusing. You remember they were accusing that you're teaching people to forsake Moses. So I can see how the translator of that English text noticed that in this usage here, the accusation had to do with indictment by motive. Like we would say, your motive for doing this is to cause the people to forsake Moses. And again, it's the same word, stand away. So if we just went in and plugged in the same word everywhere, stand away, stand away, stand away, stand away, now we're back to context. However, the translators, for example, of the King James Version of the Bible that we now have today had already noticed these terms being the same word, and then you have to decide, how is this being used? So what he reduced all this down to was that the falling away equals departure, which he says is the rapture. So he makes quite a step from, so falling away, 1, 2, 3, let's just do that. He takes the translation falling away, says it should be departure, and because of that, it refers to the rapture. And he made a good point about the definite article. He's talking about this as an event, but Paul said by using the verb, it's future. He was referring to a future event as well. So here's the conclusions that he came to. If we take falling away, which remember, that's a usage. That's a usage. Which ironically, he said, words have different meanings in different contexts, but in this case, he wants all of the words to mean departure. And then he built his case that the departure refers to the rapture, and the day of Christ, he makes that a synonym for the day of the Lord. And then he takes the abomination of desolation. He quotes Daniel 9. So that's very normative as far as future construct, pre-tribulation. He then says pre, mid, or pre-wrath, or post, or all those others. He says, oh, that's false, which was very frank, if you will. He was very adamant about it. It really didn't demonstrate a consistency with his assertion that different contexts, there could be different meanings, because in that case, in some ways, he made a context for falling away being legitimate because it's a different context and a different circumstance under which he's speaking. I was consulting, and I'll hurry because there's a lot to cover here. Well, let me get back to this. I was consulting this 1 Timothy 4, and he had mentioned something about people using Greek lexicons and whatever. I don't know why I think he spoke somewhat in a diminutive manner of that, and yet he used all this language. So I'm not sure what that's about. But if you go to that 1 Timothy 4:1, and we do, you go use your blueletterbible.org. See if I can get that to where it cleans up for you. There you go. Well, I hope you can see that. I can't see. There we go. And when you punch that in, you'll notice that you go to that term and you show Strong's information. It says here, to remove actively, instigate to revolt, usually reflexively to desist, such as this middle idea here, this they stand away from, depart, desist, usually reflexively to desist, desert, like someone, they used to be called deserters when they would go AWOL or wouldn't report from the draft for the draft. Depart, draw away, fall away, refrain and withdraw self. So the Strong's data, which I think he even referenced Strong's, how some people might go to that, but it shows the different usages. But it's still the same. The word means stand away. Now, how is it being used? So he made a case where the rapture, the fallen away is the rapture, the day of Christ, day of the Lord, which is correlative. That's very appropriate. He didn't contradict any text. And he mentioned the man of sin, the lawless one in the future, quoting from Daniel. That's very often and very normative, and that's been taught that way for some time. So here in the Grace Commentary by the Grace Evangelical Society, Dr. Bob Wilkin, for example, he says the expression the falling away or the apostasy, and he mentions the apostasia, need not mean that once apostasy occurs in the church age, the day of Christ is here. He says, admittedly, the falling away is a vague expression. Since it is the apostasy, it might refer specifically to the abomination of desolation. If so, then the many false teachings of this age merely foreshadow the ultimate apostasy, that event which Dr. Felter pointed to and said it's one-time event, foreshadow the ultimate apostasy to come. When Paul wrote, the temple still stood. However, in AD 70, the temple was destroyed and has not yet been rebuilt. Then the conclusion is drawn. The temple must be rebuilt either before the tribulation starts or during the first days of the tribulation. The man of sin will not exalt himself as God in the temple until it is restored in Jerusalem. Now, that's a very consistent interpretation according to the futurist construct, and it doesn't really ring any alarms. It's just the language issue. The idea that this falling away would then be a departure, which would then be the rapture, that's a complete 180 degree that I'm not sure everyone is prepared to realize. And that's why I said he's very adamant, makes a very good argument. But that's a complete about face, if you will, this direction, where it certainly shores up, builds his case, but I don't know that when the Lord returns and the dead in Christ are raised first and we simultaneously together with them are relocated, just as they are. I'm not sure this text needs that. But as far as the language, I would stay with what he says about context. It's actually usage. Here, words have different usages. That would be linguistically correct. But the word stand away, you could just go and plug that in if you took, as he didn't recommend, but you could take a concordance and find every one of these terms. And once you've done that, you have to start over and go to the context. But in this class, I'd recommend you pursue what were they referring to, what would make those who were involved in what we now have today, the English Bible, King James, what caused them to come to this usage. And they were consistent with, in the future, the last times, there will be those who depart. And then they were very good at noticing the indictment was to suggest the motive of those who preached Jesus were to cause people to forsake Moses. Again, that's somewhat consistent with the language and accusations against Jesus during his lifetime. Let me come over here where you can see the board, and then I'll be quiet and leave you alone. But what I really did, what caught my attention when it was brought to my attention about dispensationalism all over again, and I would like to really review that, but I thought I'd start here because he seems to be one of the most very structured, very professional, very consistent, and he's very concise. So if you go to Rightly Dividing the Word of Truth YouTube channel, you'll see Dr. Paul Felter. He has very short, concise, very well presented, and he articulates well. What it did for me, though, is when I noticed that in dispensationalism, I noticed that this leading dispensationalist, because he seems very competent, he has books, and if I can find a way to purchase those, I would look forward to having those as well. He has a chart that's free of charge. I recommend you get that, look at that, notice the rationale. But notice, though, that what we're looking at now is, for us, what I would be intrigued with is when I read a text and here they say, "will depart," the verb from which we get the noun, or the noun from which we get the verb, stand away. And then notice that they say forsake, which is a noun, as he pointed out. And then you see a teacher like Dr. Paul Felter go from falling away, should be departure, and the definite article makes it the raptured. And he has good rationale. That's really what I admired the most in his case he made. It's just, for us in language, I can't accept that the language wouldn't support us saying that it couldn't be falling away, it couldn't be forsake, and it always has to be depart. We couldn't say that. And I wouldn't say that he would insist that this be changed as well, but he did his own paraphrase, his rewrite of the text. You can go through it. He'll go through that. And yet it's very difficult because when we have our understanding, we can import that into the text. But he did something I had not seen before. He went to earlier English text rather than, and yet he starts with talking about the Koine Greek, apostasy, the noun, or apostatize, the verb. But he starts with Greek and then renounces Strong's and lexicography and lexicons. And then he goes to earlier English translations, and then he calls into question the King James Version. So that's quite let's just say it's a daunting challenge to call into question usage without first considering the context, and that it's very consistent with what was indicated in the King James text, and very much consistent with, notice the usage here, the translators noticed that there was an indictment which had to do with motive, and that's what people charge you with, that you're up to something. You can't just be doing right, you can't just be studying, but you can. But I'm looking forward to studying dispensationalism. I have one book by Dr. Gene Kim. I haven't begun to even look through it, but I really think this gentleman's YouTube channel, and the way he's so precise and concise, and he chisels his way through it, and he's quite conclusive. He makes it's refreshing to me how frank he is. I don't take it personally when he places things under a broad title, false doctrine, and he says bogus. So if that type of stuff bothers you, it shouldn't by now, not if you've studied. And you get a critical ear, start listening and being more careful to listen. But this is a good lesson to notice that really what we need to remember in language is usage and meaning two different things. And sometimes you can even go to a dictionary and it'll tell you how it's used, just as I showed you in the lexicon. Strong's was showing all these different places how it's used. But meaning is still the same. Stand away from. Your context will determine how the author's using it. And then when you are tasked to translate it, let's say if you were in the position of those who produced what we call the English Bible, like Tyndale was involved, and much of what he did was still retained in the King James Version. And it's your responsibility to make the decision, here depart, here forsake and they're falling away, you'll have to have a rationale for it. And I would love to know that and understand what they were doing. Now, of course, we have context. So look forward to this study and future evaluations from the Dr. Paul Felter, because he's done a lot of work, and I'm glad he did. But when he invites us to participate from the view of language, that's really where I want to conclude. So notice we have depart, forsake, and falling away. So you can do all that research and notice this is not just some flippant work to produce what we have as our English Bible. It's not a flippant work. It wasn't an easy task. And if you go back to meaning and you place that in every text, which is great, you then have the greater work to know when to say it by usage. The author is referring to a departure from the faith, a motive to forsake Moses, and an indictment of a future ultimate falling away. So you have a blessed day. Enjoy this lesson.